is getting more aggressive in the South China Sea. You argued that what she is learning in the South China Sea and from observing American approaches to countering Russia and Iran could prove ominous for Taiwan, Japan, and China's other neighbors in Asia.
So American actions in the South China Sea are reinforcing conclusions that Xi Jinping may be drawing from American responses to developments in Europe and the Middle East. That the Biden administration is at times effectively paralyzed by fears of escalation.
China seeks to replace the current rule-based world order backed by the U.S.
We're deepening our relationship with the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force.
Does it have the capabilities? What will be a practical strategy for America to defend the current global order, given that the axis of disorder exists and America is not in the unipolar world it used to live in?
It's a very difficult thing for the United States to do right now. It will take statesmanship of the kind that the United States has arguably not seen in decades.
Michael Mazza is the senior director at the Project 2049 Institute. We discussed whether China, Russia, and Iran are able to remake the world. Thank you, Mr. Mazza, for joining Zooming In today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, let's talk about your recent article, The Axis of Disorder, How Russia, Iran, and China Want to Remake the World. You made the very important point that China is testing the U.S. in a number of ways. You specifically discussed China's aggression against the Philippines in the South China Sea. And you argued that what she is learning in the South China Sea and from observing American approaches to countering Russia and Iran could prove ominous for Taiwan, Japan, and China's other neighbors in Asia. So I think this is a very, very important observation. So can you start by explaining what China has observed and why is it ominous for America's allies?
Sure. So American actions in the South China Sea are reinforcing conclusions that Xi Jinping may be drawing from American responses to developments in Europe and the Middle East. That the Biden administration is at times effectively paralyzed by fears of escalation. So in the case of China's pressure on the Philippines, the United States has issued a number of strongly worded statements. It has worked to expand its access to Philippine bases through new agreements with Manila, and it has provided aerial overwatch in the South China Sea, watching what China is doing. But none of those actions entail incurring much, if any, risk. Right? China does not see the United States putting anything on the line to defend an ally's interests, or indeed to defend an ally's ships, right, in the case of the Philippines. When we think about Ukraine and Israel, I would argue that the Biden administration's approach since the start of each of those crises has been primarily focused on avoiding escalation with Russia or with Iran and other groups in the Middle East, focused on avoiding escalation with them rather than on shaping positive outcomes like victory. And so, America's other treaty allies, not to mention Taiwan, which of course is not a treaty ally, but is a close security partner, they would be right to be concerned about how Washington would respond to crises that would direct them and involve them, directly, and maybe concerned that China is becoming emboldened by Washington's timidity in the face of challenges elsewhere.
Right. I think China's threats towards Taiwan have been increasing all these years. Before, in 20 years, China crossed the medium line in the Taiwan Strait 4 times, but now it's a regular practice. So how does Taiwan really feel about all these escalation of threats and America's reactions?
Yeah, so we have seen since 2016, since the election of the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, we've seen China launch a sustained pressure campaign against Taiwan. So in that campaign, China has used wide variety of tools, military coercion, the crossings of the median line that you refer to, other types of military activities in the Taiwan Strait and near Taiwan. It has used economic leverage to punish Taiwan. It has used diplomatic relationships to put pressure on Taiwan to isolate Taiwan. All with the goal of making other countries uncomfortable with engaging with Taiwan directly, and with the hope, I think, of convincing Taiwan that resistance is futile, that Taiwan would be better to give in to Chinese demands ultimately than continue to defend its own existence as a sovereign, independent country, right? Which is objectively what it is. So Taiwan has been dealing with this for 8 years. Taiwan is very concerned with what has happened in Europe and in the Middle East. It saw the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, not as some distant, far-off war that it had no interest in, but as really a fundamental challenge to the norms regarding sovereignty, to global order, in which settling disputes by force is supposed to be a last resort, and has been quite worried about the course that things have taken in Europe, and again now in the Middle East as well. In Taiwan, there's an understanding that there is a broad challenge from an axis of authoritarian powers to the presiding order, and Taiwan is looking to the United States. It's watching closely the way we deal with these crises, to look for clues on how the United States might respond to a crisis in the Taiwan Strait.
Wow. I think China is testing not only America, but also Taiwan. So do you think that the recent elections in Taiwan are indicative of the Taiwanese people's attitude towards Beijing and cross-strait relations, or do they mainly reflect Taiwan's domestic political dynamics?
Well, I think it's both. That William Lai won with a plurality of the vote rather than an outright majority, and that the two major opposition parties both had substantial vote hauls of their own. Now, this suggests to me a lack of consensus within Taiwan society regarding a number of issues. This past election was not dominated by questions of external policy. Like in many other democracies, Taiwanese are concerned about youth unemployment, about wages, about expensive housing, and all of those sorts of domestic policies played an important role in this election as well. I would also argue that while cross-strait questions, of course, remain salient political issues in Taiwan, they are perhaps not quite as divisive in the way that they once were. Generally speaking, voters are looking to all parties, whether that be the DPP, the opposition KMT, the TPP, a newer party, looking to all those parties to maintain peace and the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. The debates today are much less about unification or formal independence, or the ins and outs of the nature of the relationship with China.
Okay, let's talk about another argument in your article. So you argued that the United States has an interest in defending the world order in which it has thrived. If Washington fails to do so, a Chinese turn to aggression will become far more likely. You also talked about the U.S. has been spreading democracies to the furthest reaches of the world after dissolution of the Soviet Union. Is defending the current world order and spreading democracy everywhere the same thing?
No, I would say that. I don't think defending the current world order and promoting democracy are one and the same. But from an American perspective, I do think they are related. Why? Because liberal democracies, like the United States and like Taiwan, are more likely than authoritarian countries to buy into the current international structures that constrain anarchy, that foster free flows of trade and finance and information. And liberal democracies are less likely to seek radical revisions to global order than authoritarian countries, which I would argue is what Russia and Iran and China are in the process of doing.
Not the same. The reason I ask this question is because America's past practice of spreading democracies around the world has actually created a lot of skepticism at home. For example, the war in Iraq. The question is whether America should focus on its own domestic issues or still act like the post-Cold War unipolar power that seized the moment to spread democracies everywhere.
Look, I would say that the United States learned some painful lessons in its attempts to help promote democracy in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular. Um, but the United States has had success promoting democracy without using force in the past, through sometimes direct ways via support for dissidents and activists, sometimes indirectly via the force of its example. Um, my argument would not be that the United States should be, forcefully fostering democratic institutions on countries around the world, but that promoting the spread of democracy, encouraging the spread of democracy remains or should remain a key tenet of America's approach to the world. I don't see a tension between that and managing domestic problems at home.
Hmm. Trump's rise underscores the fact that a large number of American population believes that globalization has hurt ordinary people in America, while it has greatly benefited China. So is globalization the product of the world order that the United States helped establish after World War II?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I would argue that on net, globalization has benefited Americans. Economic growth, rising living standards, rising life expectancies. These things are all deeply tied to globalization, which we might just simply say means the free flow of international trade and finance. And now, to be sure, the benefits of globalization have been distributed unevenly, and some Americans, too many Americans, have been left behind. But I would argue that's a failure of domestic U.S. policy and political imagination. I would say that to withdraw from a globalized world, to turn our backs on globalization, would effectively be to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and would have the effect of impoverishing far more Americans than globalization ever did.
Okay, that's interesting. In your article, you talked about the axis of disorder that is China, Russia, and Iran. Can you explain what their respective interests are and what are the prospect for these actors to cooperate given these differences?
Yeah, sure. So to vastly oversimplify, all three, Russia, Iran, China, all are in one way or another opposed to an international system in which they are simply one among many sovereign equals. Moscow and Beijing in particular both have imperial pretensions, which, though distinct, have them eager to lord over their peripheries, and perhaps in China's case, to establish global hegemony. Iran has similar aspirations for the Middle East, though it also has it has religiously motivated goals as well, namely to spread Shia Islam by force if necessary. So I would argue that all three, Russia, China, Iran, all three are revisionist states. They may not precisely agree on what world order should ultimately look like. They may not agree that there should be one single world order, but they are united in opposition to the current order as it stands. I would say they're not sitting around the table, coordinating their challenges to the international system, but they support each other. They take advantage of opportunities that they afford to one another. And frictions certainly do exist. China and Russia have a longstanding antagonistic history, which they are beyond for the moment, but perhaps not permanently. But again, I think these frictions are manageable as long as these three countries see themselves as facing common enemies.
Yeah, okay, common enemy's enemy is a friend. So how far can they go? How much damage can they do?
They can do plenty of damage. So look, we're already seeing this in Europe and in the Middle East. The invasion of Ukraine is unsettling Europe in a way that it has not been unsettled in decades. on the one hand, we've seen Finland and Sweden join NATO, which I would argue is a good thing. It can contribute to regional stability. On the other hand, much of Eastern Europe is facing a threat from Russia that many had assumed was a thing of the past. This is going to change the way that countries in Europe engage with one another, the way they engage with us, the way they engage with Russia, the way they prioritize their resources. And all of that is going to have follow-on effects that over time may be difficult for us to predict. In the Middle East, there's reason to be concerned that the current war between Israel and Hamas is the beginning of a much longer, much wider regional war, again, with implications that will be difficult to predict. And China, meanwhile, in my opinion, is probably biding its time. It's happy to see Russia and Iran and Iranian proxies challenge the United States and United States allies and partners, challenge the existing international system, the international structures which help to frame the way countries engage with one another. And when that system is sufficiently weakened, China will feel emboldened to act on some of its own ambitions in Asia.
I know you haven't watched Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin, but I just want to maybe get your thoughts on one of my observations. So I think majority of the time Putin spent in this interview is to elaborate America with the West after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but the West rejected Russia by continually expanding NATO eastward. So it is the West that pushed Russia to the point of war, where Russia had no other choice. So after watching this part, I had a thought that I don't know if Putin is suggesting or hinting that Russia still wants to change its trajectory by getting closer to the West. When I talked to folks in China, they told me that they never trusted Russia. They always feel that someday Russia might sell China as a pledge to defect to the West, if you will. So do you think that's possible?
In a word, no. Not as long as Russia remains under the leadership of Vladimir Putin or other leaders that are, in his mold. I think the comments that you describe, and again, I haven't seen the interview myself, but the comments you describe are more likely aimed at giving Americans, I would argue, gullible Americans who don't see that Russia has ill intentions, who want the United States to reduce its commitment to Europe, is giving them an argument for doing so. I don't think it's sincere. I don't think that there is an opportunity for the United States and Russia to find meaningful ways to cooperate. Again, as long as Russia remains under the type of regime that it does, our interests are simply too divergent, and I don't think we can gap them, even as we, or I should say, bridge those differences. Even as we may both have concerns about the rise of China.
Interesting. What will be a practical strategy for America to defend the current global order, given that the axis of disorder exists and America is not in the unipolar world it used to live in?
Yeah, this is a very tall order. It's a very difficult thing for the United States to do right now. It will take statesmanship of the kind that the United States has arguably not seen in decades. It requires political leadership in Washington that is able to persuasively and effectively make the case to the American people for U.S. leadership in a fracturing world, and for a commitment of resources to mending that fracturing world. This means not only an embrace of the liberal international economic order, of globalization, of maintaining those free and open flows of trade and finance and information, especially among democratic countries. But it also requires major investments in American and allied military capabilities, and perhaps most importantly of all, in America's greatest strength, which is its people. Right. So The United States needs to address its internal divisions, partisan divisions, its educational shortfalls, but it can't step back from the broader world while it does that. We are in the unique and challenging position of having to address major problems at home while we do the same abroad. And again, absent really visionary leadership, it is going to be difficult for the United States to do that.
Well, Mr. Mazza, these are all my questions. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I think that's it for me.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Simone.